jealous. Not my poor sister.
I've been video all
You know, I kind of like size, but a little bit. Not a lot.
I like them just a little bit.
Just a little bit.
Just enough to use them.
Yep.
No, don't you dare. I knew that was going to happen. Okay.
Oh, I thought my sister died. I thought I had no recovery. Oh, now
Yeah,
you
now you don't.
There we go.
Now you don't. Don't worry, Bryce. You're gonna die. So.
Yeah.
No. I'll get on there. I can lose second place. I don't win the game. I used to lose.
Oh, what is it?
I don't win the game. I used to get second place.
That's fine.
Pretty much my
As long
signature.
as you don't lose your spot.
Losing changed my signature.
When your lightning bolt, when your lightning bolt is taller than you.
They said you can take my signature if you want. It's great.
You don't want it.
It's losing.
Yeah, mine is losing. That's my signature move. Yours is winning. You want trade?
I mean,
I would.
I really can't beat Alex. It's really hard to lose to him.
I would. That was really funny.
Got him.
I would have beat Nathan once. That was when he was thinking about and I ducked at him. I got Mario and he's like,
How did that?
I don't know.
That's so funny, man.
I don't know what to do, man. I'm just gonna. I was gonna jump off the edge myself. But
As long as no one takes my signature, we're all good. You guys see all the new shirts at the end of the hallway?
Yes.
Yes.
I know.
I don't
I'm
the
looking
dots.
at
The polka dots.
Seriously, like the polka dot one?
Dude, the polka dots are my favorite.
the
Polka dots.
Like Pokemon.
Do they
No, polka dots.
They're polka dots.
And
I gotta go put my soul in the bucket.
I think they're
The
not-
bucket.
What? I'll be back. Oh, I gotta go. You're nearly done, Alex.
Do you even?
No, Alex! Get out there!
Alex!
I hurt my little cock here.
Ow! I almost like broke my ankle.
Look at the Gucci album. That is such ankle support.
What?
Look at like the Gucci album with all the ankle support.
I got
Oh,
sick. I got
no.
sick.
That's why I didn't
Swallowed
break it.
up and jump off the
If
edge.
you had done that, you would have broke your ankle. But I have.
Hey, don't.
I got something. Steel. Or bone. Same thing though. I used to hate smacking so do I. Sometimes by
Pen play.
No!
Oh, whoa!
I
Did
thought
you
it was
see
so
that midair hit?
Wait, oh my, just watch it. I have it. It's right here. Look at that.
That's weird.
I didn't know there was an edge.
I swallowed the
Yes,
pill. I want to take some pills. Here,
Closer,
doctor,
closer.
doctor, can you prescribe me some pills?
You gotta get a little closer.
Right. I almost had it. Hey, get
No!
out!
Do not grab me like that.
Oh my goodness. Oh, she grabbed it right.
I can't grab.
Yeah.
This man had a snake.
No!
You gonna try Kirby?
No,
No! Not the Kirby salmon!
He was watching us over and playing. He's like,
You look awesome.
No! Back off!
I thought he had the
he jumped
I
in.
know. It's not just something like here.
Oh,
I like doing stuff too.
we might be a challenge.
Especially if you get a
You can even have that on it.
Oh my goodness. How did I miss this?
So I swallowed it.
What's the point?
Nate,
It's just like
Nate.
That's not my name.
I want
I'm talking to Nate, the other Nate.
but I want Disney
I saw what you're trying to do, Alex.
Oh, it's all good. Well, mom's gonna cook and ice cream.
Why do you do that?
Well, you know what it had? Peanut butter and had it. It was like a drumstick. I didn't really say to my dad.
I wrote
Did you ask him why he did it?
Well, the ice cream was really good. He didn't know he was gonna so I feel like the peanut butter was hard on the inside. But it was hard.
What?
Nice shade.
when you drive.
Wasn't
Yeah,
expecting to
John,
have to
thank
play
you.
against someone with an energy.
No! Why you playing? Oh my goodness! Someone's down here. I didn't move. Back away.
Oh, he finally lost the salmon. I can't let it
I mean,
win.
did I got rid of him?
Oh, but he lost it. No! Seriously?
Oh, no, don't you dare kick. Oh my gosh.
Nathan doesn't
Yep.
lose anything unless he wants to. Oh my goodness! Who did that?
Me.
If it wasn't Bryce, I would kill you right now. But I was Bryce. That was just I need you not gonna do that.
No! I was expecting you to do the thing you've been
Hey,
doing.
Nate, you want to team up?
Good name.
That one's big thing. Do it right. So you. Matt, stop.
I mean, we still sometimes call him
Bryce, we're teaming up apparently.
No, we're not. Never mind. I'm being. That would be a very
Yeah, that was a dumb idea.
That would be a very.
Because then you can eat me and we can be double.
Yeah.
That would be a very serious.
Wait, that was good.
Wait, are we on teams?
No. Oh, Matt's gonna eat me. Are you serious, Alex?
Sorry,
I was literally.
I was going for Nate and you followed him.
I'm not sure. Excuse me.
I was insanely cool.
Sniper shot.
And I'm going to lose.
No, running from Alex.
Your signature move stays.
I can't lose it. That was sick.
Isn't that the most beautiful sound in the
Dude,
world?
I love it. It's just like, no!
It's not what you want.
Dang it! Why did you have to do that?
I don't know. I don't know why I'm so off. I told Ali I'm there.
Oh, yeah.
Nate doesn't do anything when he hits me. Nate, why haven't you been up? Because of it.
I'm feeling tired.
Not
I was
doing
sniping
great, bro.
3 times in a row.
I know, it's very sad.
Sad. And I don't even like
No!
intend to hit you last time. I've been trying to hit back every time.
Yep.
No!
How am I doing this? I'm so proud of myself right now. It's kind of math, but. Those company guys.
Three sons.
No!
Oh, God, man, I was sincere. That's like,
I didn't think you'd ever use that.
Yes, I'm a doctor. Take your pill. Take your dang pill.
Hey, ready?
they don't.
Does anyone have force calls?
No.
Yeah, yeah, JR does.
Oh, he does.
He does?
Do you have force calls?
Oh!
Yeah,
Damn
please,
it!
skill hand.
God damn it! God damn it!
I got it. Oh, yeah.
We can trap him.
I got Bryce.
Oh, dang it, sorry.
No, you don't gang up on my guy.
I'm not.
No, get back here.
Why are you running? That was so scary. God,
Why are you
that
running?
was scary.
Why are you running? I'm just
Just
running. What demon do you think? Oh,
do that.
I'll make it, whatever.
Right now, and she gets.
Bryce, come over here. Come over here. We're teaming. Me and Bryce are teaming.
I don't know, I'm on your team with you.
Nope.
How does that
Hey,
work?
Bryce, come on, stop.
It's team awesome.
Not ready? Stand over here. Got her.
What
Bryce, get
is-
over here. Get over here. Bryce. Okay, we got our guns.
I just want to kill him so I don't have to. No.
Oh, that would be cool to hit you.
Bryce, come up here. We're down there. Down there.
Oh.
No.
Get him, Nate. I believe in you. You got this.
No. No. We will not let you win over there.
Get him, get him.
But you get a day off from the next one.
Bryce, why do you keep on running away from me?
I'm just trying to run away.
Why do you run away?
Come on.
Yeah!
I'm killing
Hey,
you.
Jared,
Get behind me.
Good
So
job.
I can tell you I killed you.
Aw.
But I
I'm
kind of
doing
want to
fairly
play.
good.
And also, he was kind of just sitting there.
Yeah,
I know, but still, Bryce, if you stayed behind me, I would have.
yeah, you would have.
I know, but I wanted to go and do it.
Okay.
I mean, I know you would, but I'd rather have to go.
I wonder if I just like.
Sure, y'all do that.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're gonna give me some.
Church, everyone being mad at you. I'm like,
You're gonna your time frame for moving up.
No, it's not what I wanted. No, it's not what I wanted.
Somewhat non
You know, like anybody like who really gets like professionally? No, I won't let you. I think there was me.
No, well, I guess I want to look by myself, not with me.
Oh yes.
I mean, like, it's
Oh, I
usually
forgot.
you finding a
You
place by yourself and getting that right off.
I like Kirby.
Yes, I got it. Alex, I got it.
But if you look at roommates,
I like
6
the
months
mid-level
rent,
Kirby,
roommates,
but
and
I'm really bad. Like
cheap places and cheap
I
ones, like,
survived, so I never.
Got him again.
it's not that much.
Bryce, I got a kill on both of them.
Hey, what's up?
Bryce,
Do what now?
where'd you go, man?
I gotta get water.
I literally am not looking and
Got this.
I ate a moat.
Okay, you gotta
Got him.
stop.
That's my daddy told us when I was little. That's not it's all good. It's fine. Okay.
No.
You gotta eat them off the edge or something. Just
See, I love it. Like, it's just
I
sad.
know.
It's funny.
Why'd you eat it?
You gotta eat them.
No, don't give it to me. No.
You got this. Boom. Oh,
I need it to you.
that's strong for you.
Yeah, higher.
I'm team this. I like it.
I believe in you.
Elijah might go to
Kirby is just so beautiful. I don't know if it's a him or a her.
It's so beautiful you can't comprehend it.
Beyond human comprehension. Right here.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just standing over there. I don't know what to do.
Yes!
No!
No! You're not allowed to get out. That's against
Oh, no. Yes, yes. Yes.
What a win.
Oh, what a win. Was that Victoria?
I got fourth.
What a win.
It's absolutely overkill for everything right now. There's nothing I can do except for like
Hey,
4K rendering, which I never ever need to do. That my people ever end up doing. Like when on Overwatch, like okay, it's like turn everything on max, 122% detail rendering, it's like 150 frames, and I capped it at 150 frames. Like, I capped this, where would it go?
On the same day, you know.
Okey-dokey. I was laughing because after I did that, it's like on average I ended up using one.
Awkward.
Oh no.
No one cares.
So now, before it was like, oh, you know, if I run Chrome in the background, it's gonna, you know, now it's like, oh shoot, I have like 50 programs on the table. I don't need to close any of them, but I also don't really need to know.
I like it.
I don't like it.
You like it when I'm not playing.
Exactly.
Don't you dare hit me. I want to eat Skittles.
Yeah, I can do
Go
it.
back right now. Bow down in front of me. Like that. No, bow down. I didn't say just squat. Okay.
This is a workout.
You're for here.
She's like that.
Are you gonna see me again? Do it again. Come back over here.
I just somebody that does hair.
Okay.
That
Give it.
Pretty much it's gonna be like,
that goes for
I
that.
love those over here.
I have to kind of get into
Time
it.
for you to
And
do
so
it.
many moves.
Those over here.
Yes.
It's really
If you hit me, you have to bow down in front of me or else you die.
several
Okay,
months.
Alex, come down right now.
I'm not
Do
gonna
it.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
What's that, clown?
That's fine. That's fine, Alex.
I'm sure the replay ability is going to be, unlike Unicorn Surge.
Hey, get Bozo.
Oh, that's right.
Why is everybody going?
You're here
No, not everyone's going for you. I haven't even touched you yet.
It's just
It's just
The
Alex.
game only has
What
like
if fucking
9
say,
saves.
look at that Bozo. That's like legit the only reason.
You go against
I
the
did that
nine
Bozo.
times, and you have to kill off one kid. It's like 40 hours in this game. You
Why
gotta
is
kill
there
him.
match but no
I don't want it.
pieces?
Too bad.
Yeah, right?
New Game Plus doesn't exist yet. We might do that. Here's critical.
Oh, hello.
Just dial it. I want to just dial it. I just play Dark Souls.
How do you like my Bible, Jonathan? You like it very much. Hey, Jonathan.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Sanderstone is the favorite fish.
Bozo. I'm not gonna make that more. Yo, hey, Bozo.
Did you just do that?
Boys Baba now.
My favorite thing is like, because I haven't played them and I've watched a bunch of speedruns and I've seen a lot of strats on it.
Boom, brother.
I saw that.
A lot of the bosses. And he got to the Moonlight boss, which is like one of the easier bosses, and he could not beat it. And then he rage quit. And it was like, bro, it's like the second boss.
Hey, yeah, I know. I can change.
I told everyone I was
Yes, you can.
I can
Yeah, you can change as soon as you know you're not getting last.
Yeah.
My friend didn't stop.
Yeah. That's pretty much the story.
She did it back in a safe way.
Hey, Matt, you want to see?
Why? Because I keep on guiding you?
Grab him.
No.
Yes. Most beautiful Bible word.
Yes.
No.
I can't see what that edge of the screen.
I know, me neither.
I know.
The
Get over here.
Yay! I'm just gonna casually get over here. What do you gotta do?
Oh, no, I don't like. Bozo, I'm not teamed up, but we're just chill. We got our own.
I'm at Alex, you just killed him. You should finish suicide.
Pretty much. I kind of agree with that. But whatever.
I did too much damage to you. Come on, Alex, see what you got.
No! Oh my god. God, it's not very good.
I died once so far.
Really?
Come on, bro.
Everyone else is
Yeah.
You've never done it physically.
I've been doing
What's
that.
that?
I'm not doing it.
Is that your special technique? Like you
Come here.
special ability?
Yeah. That's the thing too. I can't get up now.
No, right? That would just not be you. You wouldn't want to try and get someone to not. Are you kidding me right now? When someone says that, are you kidding me right now? Right?
I'm being me.
When someone says I pull up like
You can't.
Yeah, right?
Wait, who told you?
And I can do a triple back.
I thought that all the time. It's the truth though.
It's all you.
No, no, no. Your sister never told you. Do you do anything? Yes, yes, I got that. Yeah.
Oh my goodness! I am so scared. Kill those up.
Yeah, get close to
Kill those up.
No.
Yeah. Okay,
Oh, you're
I
trapped.
will be nicer to you now.
Come on. Yeah, you better be.
Not that being nice to you, but I'm not good, but.
And this, are you kidding me right now, Nick? Are you?
Sorry.
Don't worry, I got him. I got him trapped. What?
Oh!
He escaped and swallowed. He must have been trained by the wizard.
Ooh,
By the
no spot to
wizard
sit
Phoenix.
down.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
I'm coming behind. I'm on a caravan.
Why am I going so slow?
It's a caravan.
You know what you're doing?
Are you kidding me?
What?
Wrong
Wrong person. You would not be no reason.
I just hit button. I don't know what I'm doing. I just hit button. I'll hit someone. Not you though.
Better not be.
You tried that.
No.
Down the way.
No, okay.
Wrong person.
I didn't mean to. I was trying to get him because if I would have got him, then okay, guys, come on.
See this guy over here, you can just stand there.
Got him.
Like, stand so yes or no.
Right?
Oh, sorry,
my
Alex.
goodness.
Yeah, it's right.
Yeah, I'm super cool. That's what I thought.
No one tries to
That would be funny.
Yeah, I think you remember saying like, yeah, like that price. Like,
They're gonna go down. Okay, there we go.
Alright.
He's 44. I'm pretty sure.
Never knew that.
Oh, what? How?
I'll let you be. I'll wait to my corner.
That's guys.
Oh no, that's
What's
bad
that?
strategy.
Well,
Oh my
what
goodness.
is
I'm gonna get high. Hold on, give it to me. I'll hit it hard.
The steroids on steroids.
Oh, I think somebody gets braces with like, yeah, obviously.
I'm sorry, boy.
Why?
Sorry, boy.
wait, have you ever bowed down before?
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about the yoga.
You said you wanted to your dog. I said to my chest. I have two right here.
I could have struck out by a lightning right there.
I'm like, that.
But how?
It goes through the roof.
Well, dog.
I mean, I
You
have
can
it,
kind
but-
of see
I'm
Hey, no,
assuming.
no. Wait, why did he go so high?
See, it doesn't go through the roof, it goes to the window.
It's up there, and so
Yes!
I have it on right
No! You know how to escape your
No.
brain.
Yeah, over here, that would explode. I'm gonna hide it for expander because I have a flashlight.
Oh my goodness! What was that? I'm scared. I'm thoroughly terrified.
No, what are you doing?
Oh yeah! Dude, this is why the controllers break.
Well, it's not throwing on the ground. Your brother's out of control.
Like, that's no place to do fucking anymore.
I've been so much dead.
You guys are wild, guys.
Got him.
No,
We're not.
you have an eye or
That's right.
you have an eye.
Right. Right.
You don't qualify. You just qualify.
There's two of you guys.
Well, I hate your face.
There's two.
You just burst into your stuff.
Yeah, the one that I want to do I.
No, there's not.
Nathan is the one that I want to do
Yeah, there is.
I didn't know who he was until Alex told me about him.
Wow. But I've never seen him.
And it's so because I did not activate the eye and then the why I did it. So good. No, I said it wasn't. It was the stop what you wanted to find out.
I wouldn't do that. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm really good. And then like I got it like 1 second and I'm like
No, that doesn't scare me. No. You kill Kirby? I mean, look at that. Wow. You lost so really quickly. You got a really deep dive in the tail.
I know.
What the heck?
Yeah,
No,
dude, if you hit up,
it's easy.
if he does it every time you hit up, it's awesome.
No, wrong way. If you do that button, people lose health.
You have to like pull up and do it, and just pull up.
Yes.
I believe in you, Nate.
Oh no.
No, man. No.
Yeah!
I said you're always gonna be like that.
That's how we're friends. Oh my goodness, I just got.
What?
Dude, I actually got.
yeah, I did that. That's exactly
What?
how I that happens to a lot of
Amazing.
Like actually
I'm so cute on my cheering right there. I've got in third place 3 times in a row. Yeah.
I think you needed to make
No, 2 times in a row. I'm the boss on it.
That's not good enough. Someone's gonna call coming in and
so
someone's playing the game.
my
Well,
mom.
I can't gear it up. That's my thing. You have to, you win. Or you second place. Nate got his thing. He wins.
Right, so
He
you're
got his thing. He gets 4th place.
Right, you can be spite. You can be spite. You spiteful.
I'm very spiteful. Spiteful and proud.
Sprout.
Sprout?
Yeah, bro.
What sprout? Good English. English machine bro.
I can do it.
I don't like it if that's freaking
I don't like being. What is it? That was amazing. I don't know how you did that. Was amazing. No, stop.
I can be an egg if I want to be. I grow up, I want to be an egg.
I know a little kid.
I lost that with the egg?
Right, the egg deals damage to whoever's in it.
And when I was little,
I know, but did the egg block that though?
I know a little kid.
Yes, it did.
If you do gymnastics, it's like you get in trouble kind of finding stuff in the door. You know, Dave, it's his little brother.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
No!
Yeah. Yes.
Oh my god! He's 7. Other siblings other than the boy?
Yeah, so he's also his little brother.
Well,
And they
how
adopted,
many,
they adopted a little boy.
are they all in the house though, or
Yeah.
are they like,
So those
yeah.
two find
Okay,
me.
that's like
And then
so much.
and then Sam and then Danny, who's a little younger. And then they adopted a little Danny.
Oh, I'm a slut.
Yeah, we don't adopt them. I already hit you once.
And not even,
Oh, why did we do that?
oh, I hit someone with my recovery. Did that literally move you like half a pixel? The non-recovery? Hey, it's better than Jiggly's.
those anniversary leaders?
Yeah, I like.
But Jiggly has like
Message is really hard. It's
pretty much doesn't even exist. It's so bad.
if you do it right
So
now,
do you.
I make sense.
Yeah, you have to do it.
like you can go to long to guide and
We have all of our returns. Up there. Down there. You don't have to straight in the pro, but if you could just pull some off the top, so your 10 stack pokes the ceiling out.
I used to love.
Even if you take the first 2 turns,
What did I do?
stack them this
Oh, it's my down B.
She is nice, but she's not
So yeah, you could do that with something real quick and I'll just get
No!
Alright guys, pause the game! Seriously, pause the game.
I don't know.
We have all of our new chairs now.
I saw it in my left.
And you guys get to go transport them into the room.
Yeah.
Privilege!
I like the ice.
I don't
long with me. I don't want to be alone.
All the chairs are together in the hall. You want to grab one and bring it back? Or not. Just more of those, but in new colors.
Did you have that colorful chairs?
Ooh, that's not how it works. It's because we don't usually cook with strawberries, huh? You can cook foods and not get food poisoning, but why did you cook strawberries?
Okay, Alexa, this is my one-handed and this is my one-handed bad cartwheel. Ready? Oh, come on.
She's dropping off Jane downstairs. She'll be up in a bit.
I know, me too, on my foot.
No, not my foot.
On my foot.
I've never seen Julia pull her.
Ariel.
You just don't need to drop it.
That's what I'm like.
No, no.
Hold on, boys. You can just put it right back
It's
there.
not whips, he just dropped them.
Ready? She's coming at June.
Yeah.
She is.
How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
It's not in June.
Hey.
Dude, why is it only carry one?
Stop!
Go, catch me. What's July?
I don't know. It's a weird month.
Wow.
I want to sit there.
Pick up the box of it.
It's gonna fall off my shot, right?
Even though Andrew has his own chair,
Oh,
we should still try and
can I sit there?
even though we all have a chair.
No, they're meant to be split up in everyone.
But I want to sit up there.
You take the brand new chairs, and the first thing you do is try and break them.
It's not.
Yeah.
You must be a junior high boy.
Yeah.
I know, but you
Sorry, I got triple ones. Yeah, I do.
Oh! Come on, quickly!
I got right.
whoa, gymnastics.
No, I thought you were like, noticed I was gone.
No, I wouldn't have. I didn't expect someone to do something.
I mean, at first I moved it under a pillow.
I mean, I thought murder was that.
And I'm like, oh no, screw it.
It's worse than every
You probably saw it, didn't you? No? I
Big man, big boy
put it
vibe.
under the pillow while everyone was running
The
to get a
big
check.
boy vibe. The one that makes
Is that why you made the last?
Yeah.
Oh, they're gonna fall. I want golden chair.
Alright, don't sit in the stacks of chairs.
No, I didn't.
What happens if I make my own stack of chairs?
I'll scream.
No!
I'm
Oh! Let's not spread it.
not gonna pick it up at you.
I don't play enough this game, right?
Don't know that.
I do.
No. Is there a specific way you wanted the chair to stand?
Just like in our normal giant seat. If we're not gonna use them all, we could leave some stacked. I figured the inaugural day of
No,
chairs.
I literally
We should
killed
get the pick
myself
of the
every
colors.
time.
Oh, because of the. Oh, I see. So you're the real spiteful one.
Over there for now, unless you really want one of these.
Spiteful myself.
No.
No!
You know, this isn't that soft. Just to tell you, this kind of just feels like it's not. It's like not soft whatsoever.
I forgot I had no
Doesn't have to be a soft chair, but it's not a hard chair.
What are you gonna do with this?
I don't
Yeah, firm chair. That's what it is.
Yeah,
You need
but
a soft chair.
firm
Firm
chairs,
chair is much
but it's
better.
not.
Better for your back. Better for your spine.
No, it's not.
Better for your spinal column. It is.
Not to me.
Strange spine.
Why'd you do that?
I think that was you.
I think it's okay.
Oh, yeah, it was chair.
So many night wears.
I don't know. Dude, he's
little tiny to break. Little tiny to break. I know. It's just that they're not soft. They don't have to be soft. But if something it's better if they're soft. But if you're back in your stomach.
I was trying to get an egg kill, but it was a bad idea.
I only need 2 up front for the game, so I was gonna have to keep it ready to move. Beautiful.
I like this chair. This is my new chair.
Is it soft?
No.
No, they're all the same.
You gotta break it in. Actually, there's minute differences all the time. Even with different screws, some of them are missing the back strap that bolts on down here.
Yeah.
There's different kinds of silver leg. There's like the flat silver paint, and then there's like the bumpy silver paint.
And then
And
there's
then
the
the gold, I think, is all just the one kind. I don't think anything has the flat gold.
Hey, mine's gold.
I think it's all bumpily gold. It's very strange, but like they all supposedly come from the same factory. But then there's other minute differences too. Like some of them, the foam
I know what we're
wraps over the
doing.
top onto the back, and some of it only wraps onto the top, and then it ends on the top. It's very strange.
What, the double chair?
Yes.
This should be an
Well, I
interesting
was
game.
very sneaky because
I thought those chairs are better. They were broken in.
wait a minute.
Oh, I thought we were gonna be twinsies.
The more no, this right here is the more comfortable chair.
I thought we were gonna be twins. Dude, it's not comfortable at all.
This one right here is more comfortable.
I still like this chair color.
I like pretty much this chair because this chair is actually comfortable. You know, it's actually
You have the force. No.
Hey, what are you doing? Don't do that.
He was using the force. What is that table?
yeah. At this point, this chair, although it's a lot more comfortable,
You. All about design. I know what we're gonna play.
what?
Everyone better have kids smell like breath. You sit a chair and then you have to blow them and try to get them. Very dumb game.
Well, what about for the smell of the movie? Will that work? Okay. Oh, wait. What? Where? When? How? Where? Where?
Oh no.
This one?
Oh yeah, look at me.
Yes.
We used to go to this church.
A little more down.
Yeah, I used to go to this church.
A little more to the side.
Because he
A
was
little more.
actually he's
A little
not.
more. Okay, funny. Up.
Not more.
Oh my god.
I kind of wanna.
Oh my god, he's back.
Huh?
He's back.
Never mind, I'm not joking.
It's Yoshi.
Wait. I heading to the.
No, don't die, Mario, don't die. Don't die, no.
Yes!
Hit Yoshi, quick,
How do I
hit
play?
Yoshi. Hit Yoshi.
How How do you play?
Hit it. It's not making the.
Okay, so what do you want? Which one do you want?
It needs to be plugged in.
Spike! Hey, Nate, whoever wins this.
I'll plug
I
in.
didn't see him coming. I was gonna light me last time. Press start. Press start. Wait, hold on. Why didn't I get a kill on start? I killed you. Press start. I forgot you didn't give me a kill.
I think I did it.
Yes, you did it.
What if I get like that all the kills?
This hurts.
Abracadabra magic.
No,
No, it went. No, that's not it.
I think you're spent. Hit me. Oh, God. Hit that. You hit hard. I haven't played.
Ah!
It's even more legendary now. It's like the Legend of the Rainbow series.
No! You took.
I want a black.
No! You took my chair! She took my chair.
They're coming and they're horrible.
Oh my goodness, this is hard. It's like awesome.
Hard and awesome. Don't go. It's awesome. It's hard. So hard and awesome.
No, we're not.
I want a polka dot one.
B.
Hold on, I need this chair.
Not the most beautiful eyeballs.
Hunter, switch my chair. I need the polka dot one.
These aren't
I want a polka dot.
You like the stones. What are they?
Don't. I was just making it have a wavy effect.
Where are you going there, Alex?
I was giving it a wavy effect, Daniel.
I need the
I don't
polka dot one.
Yeah,
Can I
you do.
try this all?
In a moment, we're gonna play it. Yes.
I need this polka dot one.
Daniel.
All right, guys, we need to make 2 teams. Let's see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Girls
6,
against
7,
boys.
8, 9,
Well,
10,
not
11,
entirely.
12, 13.
So,
We got 13 people, so we
My
need
brother
6 and 7.
Easy boys and girls.
6 and 7. A team of 6, team of 7.
Five.
There's 5 girls.
Nathan,
You'd have to adopt a
girls,
boy.
go over there. Come on
Alex.
They're willing to adopt Alex.
Okay, Alex. Adopting you. Sorry, you don't have a choice.
You can just pray for another girl to come.
It was my voice.
okay.
Oh no, wait, you're the small team. You'd still be there. We need 2 more to come.
What are the odds?
Yeah, 2 more. All right.
Nathan.
Well, because it's 7 and 6, so if one more girl comes, then it's still just be 7 and 7 in the
Wait,
state.
now
That's not how it works.
Oh, wait,
That's not how it works.
No, wait, that's
That's how it works.
Wow.
All
You're
right.
such a good friend, Alex.
I know I am. That's why I did that.
And that's how Mafia works.
All
All right, so we are gonna be playing.
Yeah, 7 against 6.
We're gonna be playing Battle of the Storms.
Wait, what? Wait.
The game is simple. We have to test your lung capacity against your opponent.
Well, I'm gonna have one.
You better
Then you
have
lose.
that smelling bread.
What if I have power heart?
Start growing now.
Like, if your bread is bad.
Come on, lungs. Yes.
So wait, don't hyperventilate. I'm
Wondering if we pass out, do we win or lose?
We had a 4 categories.
Okay, what's the question?
So this is a team of 6, right? And that's team 7 right now?
Yeah.
What if like one of the couldn't like one of the boys go over here so then Bryce isn't like alone and that would be like this would be the team of 7 and that would be the team of 6 or something?
No, thank
Yeah, I was
you.
gonna say that, but it was more funny when Alex did
I'm telling you, Bryce! I'm telling you. Hey, Bryce! Come on, Bryce! Come on!
All right, once the game starts, that's it. There's no switching back. We're just like,
Okay, the
good.
game starts
All right, so
now.
simple game. We take 2 contestants, 1 in each chair. They don't get to scoot the chair. They don't get to leave the chair. They got to keep their butt firmly planted in the chair.
Oh!
They are intentionally scooted back from the table, so you can't get right up to the table. That's kind of the whole point. Then they must use nothing but their breath to get the ping pong balls to fall off their opponent's side of the table. Now, what we're going to be watching for is very much like ping pong.
which side did it touch last.
Can't see.
But they can't see.
Yeah.
So each person on each side is going to be wearing a blindfold. They can't see what's happening.
I don't want anyone blowing.
And we're going to be watching to see which side of the table they fell off on. Does that make sense? So if it's past the tape on this side, it's a point against this team. If it's past the tape on this side, it's a point against that.
I know. How did
Yes.
Does everyone understand?
It's called bravery, Alex.
Dizzo's sitting on rice.
Bravery. But if you're not brave enough, you can pronounce bravery with a P, and there will be more spit, which will start to break you in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Two things. One, does everyone have to go? No.
All at once.
Everyone
All
has
at
to go once? No. Can I go against
But
Alex?
what if you
don't want anyone like to breathe on your face? No.
You can be hippie instead of brave. Totally an option. You sit back, you do nothing. You probably won't get any spit on you. And it won't go in your eyes.
What if you just like let him win?
It's in your mouth.
Yeah, right.
Don't open your mouth.
I'm just gonna win. I don't want to do it. I'm just gonna let him win.
Only if you're brave.
Use your nose.
Swallow it.
Only if you're brave. You don't. If you seriously blow like this, can we blow with your nose?
Make a small target for this. Okay, go like this. Small target. Small target. If they hit that man, kudos to them. They're amazing. All right. Yes.
What if you don't have a brush in here?
That's more of a philosophical question.
What if my lunch are dead now?
More of a philosophical question.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm gonna push him.
Are you guys ready? Okay. Azane, I may need your time or your help from time to time during the reset. It's really hard to do this. You have to set all of them down on the table and wait for them to settle and like find their center of gravity and then gently move them onto the tape. It's kind of obnoxious. The faster way to do it is literally just you take 3, I take 3, and then when we say go, we just like let go. And if they fall a little left or right, it's random. It doesn't matter whose team it's on. If we both use our right hand, they'll be, my 3 will be skewed a little left, your 3 will be skewed a little right. So it'll kind of shake out even. So I may need your help later in the game if the resets are taking too long. Okay, who'd like to go first?
Not me.
Alex! I will.
All right, you're up.
Bryce, you got this.
You're gonna spit on Bryce. How do you know?
I didn't call on you, Bryce.
I should put this backwards.
No one else had their hand up.
I didn't call on you.
Okay, so you just got
No one on your team volunteers. That doesn't mean you automatically are it. That just means you get to go like 7 times. That's just nonsense. That's just goofy. All right, I'm calling on tomorrow.
No, please. Can I go
You
last?
gotta open this up. You can do it.
Can I not do
You
anything?
get the cross eyes.
Yep, that's
But I'm gonna look stupid.
Yes, but then everyone else will look stupid after you, and you'll be cheered up by the other 6 people who look stupid. And you
This
get to
doesn't
watch.
even fit on. Can I just like be like?
Do you have a tiny
Well,
hand?
then tighten it.
You're
It's
out.
Velcro.
You're out.
Dude, do you not understand the concept of Velcro?
Daniel, that's some advanced stuff.
This is space age technology.
I
Right?
know.
It was invented by NASA.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think that's true.
Who else would invent it?
That's a better question. All right, you guys
I
ready?
just close my eyes.
It doesn't really matter if you're blindfolded.
Wait, I want to see you in this room. She has freckles.
It is a little off center, which is even funnier. Like your nose doesn't line up with your eyes. Do you wanna fix it or no?
No, it's good.
It's good. I agree. All right. Em, do you want to come film? I
You're
can't
recording
be
it.
back far enough to record this.
I'm just gonna be calling.
Do you want to come
I'm
film?
just
I
gonna
can't
wipe it
stand
away.
back far
I'm
enough
Wait,
to
I'm about to
record
like,
this.
I'm just gonna blow my pants like over.
Nate,
I'm just gonna be coughing the whole time.
I'm gonna put on the blindfold and put on my glasses. Oh, it's so good.
Seizure.
Oh, no,
Oh,
no,
hey,
no, I told you.
instead, why don't you just pick up the
Don't
table
hurt
and
me.
Die.
Bring up the table.
All right, you
Why
guys
are
ready?
you
Blindfolds on. We gotta get the show on the road. Blindfolds on. On your marks. Get
I'm not gonna try. Sorry, guys. No,
get
try.
set go.
I want to win tomorrow.
That's game. That's game.
How does he know?
In one breath, you're all gone.
You got it. 6 points for red team.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to.
Shame on you.
And
Sorry. I'm gonna give these people.
three.
All right, Hunter.
I'm sorry, okay?
Hunter, hand off the blindfold.
But it's beautiful.
All right, who's next on red team? No.
I see that. That's what you wanted. Emily, can I see the video? Wait, Emily, did you take a video of that?
I'll go.
That's terrible. Emily, did you take a video of that?
Can I see the video?
No, go sit down.
Alright, let's get Alex and Lulu up here.
4 seconds.
Yeah!
Let's go, Alex!
Alex!
Wait, can I take a video of this?
I wanted to spit on Bryce.
I don't want you to win, Alex.
I wanted to spit on Bryce.
Suffering.
Great. Gonzalez face
That's
off.
why
I
I
wanted
came
to
over
spit
here.
on Bryce.
Maybe I'll pull you back up.
Yeah.
They do have 7 now.
Alex.
Come on, Lulu. You can do this.
Alex, don't forget
Alright,
to blow on there.
bottom on the chair.
Lulu,
No
Lulu,
hands up
look at
front.
me.
No
Lulu,
hands up front.
Lulu,
Keep your
wait.
hands down. Ready? On your marks. Get set. Go. All right, that is 1 point for blue team and 5 points for red team.
Got it.
Junior.
Wait, if you're playing Minecraft,
Yeah, no, this way. Let's go.
okay, Bill.
Yeah,
Just say
let's
it.
go.
Wait,
Let's go.
Can I ask you something else? Yeah, I just don't know.
It's only good people.
Breathing?
That's why nobody calls me.
Can you imagine the lung capacity
Maybe if you
Olympics?
spit that. Spit, that'd be great.
Epic.
Let's just spit on the
Lung
table.
capacity, what?
that would be a band,
like
and
of course
rockets you
I
launch
would
with your
probably
breath.
be really good at this, except for
I
I was a
wanted to spit on Bryce.
percussionist,
I'm so sad.
not something
Man,
I
I
would
was
be a
like,
lot.
or a trombone player.
Man, less than
I know.
I didn't really need a bridge.
I'm sure you do that another way all the time.
Emily,
Okay.
Like 7 seconds. It's a little bit longer. Lulu actually fought back.
You're up.
Yeah, tomorrow's just like
You
this.
what?
I know, I
You
was
don't have
like,
lungs?
I know, I was like,
Ryan, quick! You're on blue team. You're on team. Red team.
no, Alex, I was like,
need to go and take
and I saw you.
All right, you guys ready?
And I was like, let's go.
Forward.
Or maybe just
I
get
know,
nice
but if
one.
I actually tried to
On
like
your marks.
to that,
Yeah,
Get. What are you doing? Nate can't see the second you sit up. He's gonna go
Wait,
to the
what's your
chair.
name again? Ayla. Okay, let's go, Ayla.
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 On your marks. Get set. Go. Let's game. Let's game.
Nice and dead.
Very nice. 6 points for blue.
Hey, Daniel. He got one on the other side.
Say again?
He got one up.
You did?
Yeah.
Hey,
Daniel, do you realize
if it is me, make sure that
Without
Bryce
lungs?
does not.
Maybe that's the meta.
Men don't have lungs.
Hunter, what are you doing? Are you okay, Alex?
Everyone go get a lungectomy.
What
Apparently
is
it
even
helps.
happening?
Are you okay? You're just like,
Yeah, I'm good.
like,
All right, you're up.
Yeah, you stretching out.
Yeah. You're up.
Hunter, that's something, Hunter, that's something like Azari would do.
So, dude, I like super tight legs.
Okay, don't bump the table. Let's not touch the table.
What happens if someone else touches the
Are you
table?
ready? Blindfolds on.
Yeah, I
On
know.
your marks. Oh, you're touching the table.
Yeah, what are you
Stop
doing?
touching.
You want to?
On your
Touch
marks.
the table.
Get set. Go.
I really take
Come over here. Yeah!
That was 6, right?
Yeah,
6 points for blue.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we all
I'm sorry. I can't see.
She can't see either. Okay.
Yeah, what excuse?
What an excuse, yeah, right?
I'm dying. I can't.
So is that
You
2
don't have
perfects and 2 5-and-1s?
Bro, wait, if I don't have any lungs.
Guys,
No,
is that
extra
the total right now? A 5-and-1 for each team and a 6 for each team?
Sounds right.
No, because
That's a tied game right there.
Alex, that's right. What?
Tied game, guys. Tied game.
I like all 6.
It's tiny.
4 rounds in, we're tied up. All right, let's get.
Nate, you're up.
I don't know how, but my.
Okay.
And I think it's your turn.
I'm gonna be honest right here though. I think he was getting.
Low, brother.
I got one. I
got one.
You got one.
I
There
thought
was
he
a
was
recount.
getting.
There was a
I got
recount.
Oh, you don't have to go like. You can go like.
You're gonna lose all these points.
Right.
I'm sorry, do you want less
I'm a
points,
stickler
Hunter?
for the rules, okay? I don't care if you lose. It's gotta be real. Don't bump the
I
table.
just got 6 points, so I'm happy.
All right.
Okay, to be honest, you didn't
Like they'll just run away.
You're just
And
like,
completely give up.
give me your leg.
Ping pong balls
You
are
keep
very
your leg.
stiff.
Hunter!
Do you not know how to keep your hands to yourself?
Nope.
Right.
You're less than a toddler.
You're the person.
Guys, don't run around and thud.
Hunter, there's a new challenge.
Ping pong balls are
Yes,
stiff.
Cricket eyes!
All right, you guys ready?
Come on,
On your
Tessa.
marks.
Happy for my team.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Get set. Go.
Yes, Jonathan!
6 points for red.
Good strategy.
Oh, get it.
All right.
Nate!
Just
Nate!
Where is the big bibble?
Where
It's
is you-
Nate
I
versus
thought you
Nate.
went.
No,
Remember he stood up and he
That's
said
right.
no to now?
I rejected it. Who hasn't gone on this team? Only Nate? Okay, let's go Nate versus Nate.
Why would you do this? Hunter.
You
Just sit
stole
down.
it originally.
Hunter, sit down.
An uncomfortable amount of closeness happening there, Hunter.
Yeah, that was.
Hunter, you're cheating. I
just
just
said
said something.
Wait, put the
That's
glasses
the-
over. You'll be
that's
able to
where
see.
everyone-
Yeah.
Oh,
Did you see
yeah!
that?
Ah,
I just didn't know if somebody else would do this. Mission.
The corner of his eye.
Hey, those guys.
I know. The corner of like one of his eyes. Stop breathing.
Hey!
Yeah, breathing too much.
See ya!
Okay, I think we already gonna win this.
Yeah, but that's how you're supposed to win.
Stop breathing.
He's like, okay, come on, Nate.
I feel like that was a good one.
Quickly, hyperventilate.
No.
Help.
Remember, it's Nathan above all.
Oh my
Hey,
God.
come on, Nathan above all.
Above
But
all
Nathan
what?
with glasses above
Exactly.
All right, you guys ready? On your marks.
Yeah, Nathan.
Get set. Go! Was that 1 and 5 or 2 and 4?
2
Oh
and 4.
my God.
1 and 5.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, 5 points for
Wow.
this red team over here, 1 point for blue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wild strategy.
All right, Bryce and Alex.
Wait, Alex already went.
Wait until.
No, remember the teams are 6 and 7.
Wait, but those two aren't gone yet.
Yes, they have.
I love
I am
Everyone's gone.
Wait, what is the team in green shirt?
Literally everyone's gone,
Bryce.
except for Bryce.
And out.
All right. You
Remember,
guys ready?
Hey, Bryce.
we can't
No,
do
Bryce.
it.
Yeah,
Come on,
Alex.
Bryce, you can do this.
All right, Bryce, you need a perfect score.
Alex, you know the strategy.
You're down.
Stretch those hammies.
By 4 points.
What?
If you get a 5 and 1, it's a tie game. If you get a 6 and 1.
Stretch those hammies. You look like your sister.
Stop breathing.
You look like your sister a lot
Well, I
right
mean,
now. Oh my God, Winky, Winky. You look like Allie.
All right, you guys ready?
Stretch
Blindfolds
those
on.
hammies.
On your marks.
Go,
Get
Bryce.
set.
Come on, G.
Go. I didn't say it was over yet. Keep on. It's not over yet. Take the blindfolds off.
Bryce, you're the second round. You won both.
Go again.
I think it's still Bryce.
That's not my fault. Stretch those hammies.
I think Bryce wins. It was good. That was
Yes.
Did I actually win before? Like,
No, Bryce, no one won.
good. He didn't get it.
Daniel, you won.
I won.
Yeah,
Daniel.
That's right. All right, you guys want a real match?
That was
oh, you took them off?
Yeah.
Suddenly it's all worth it.
Quickly, go.
Right there. Just sit
Oh,
down.
that was awesome. Okay.
Are you guys ready? On your
probably
marks.
do.
I'm still
Why
trying to
did
get
you,
the
like-
still.
Keep it like that.
Get set.
You can't say that.
On your marks. Get set. Go.
Yes, Bryce won.
Bryce wins!
Yeah.
Woo!
Did I get all
At the last second, I dropped a king ball right in the middle.
Is that the name in the
And it hit you in the face. And you somehow managed to hit it backwards.
I
I don't even know how that's
No, you
possible.
sucked through his brain.
Very
He
nice.
sucked it through his brain.
What?
Did he win?
Yeah, he won. I know.
Wait, how much should I bet? Did you get everything?
Yeah, you want to?
Oh, what? Does that mean we win?
You won.
Wait, what?
Blue team wins. Good job, blue team.
Yeah. You want more points? Wait, can I see the video of me?
Not just the second, but yes.
I got my win. Emily.
Yeah.
Yes.
You win.
Can I have one?
Emily.
You don't deserve one.
I win. I win. You guys lose.
You know, having it on your side is what makes you lose points.
And then the other one.
Wow.
Ow! All right, everybody, grab a Bible and apologize for your poor behavior.
Sorry, Bud.
Hunter.
Good job, chicken nugget.
Hunter, what was that?
I guess so. Bryce,
He's what?
What was that goal?
here's somebody bring me up to me. That curve. You're going straight.
All right, guys, if you haven't signed up for camp by now, I apologize. You lost $10.
Dang it.
But if you did sign up for camp by now, then good job. You saved 20.
Hey, I didn't even know there was a camp.
There's a camp. It's on the street.
Yeah, I know that.
It's money. I'm not that rude. There you go.
I'm going back.
Sit down, sit down, sit down.
I'm stupid.
Not that.
All right, guys, quiet, please. We're going to cover another 1,000 years. Yes.
So when does the camp start?
Good question. There's a flyer in the kitchen. When you go to leave, you can grab it. We got to get going on this because we're going to cover 1,000 years today.
Oh, wow.
What happens if I don't want to?
Seriously, you got up and stolen my little.
Oh, that was me.
him.
That was me.
I expect better.
Are we
You
gonna
know,
start
you
doing?
said it.
Are we?
I'm disappointed, but
Are
I
we gonna
expect
start
better.
doing topic nights soon?
Yes.
And
At the end of
then-
this.
Probably
And
expecting
can we do
it to
that
go
thing
from
I know
like
where we did like
five.
like taco nights or like
That's a completely separate
what?
thing.
Oh yeah. We should do taco nights. One thing where we did like
Taco Tuesdays, and then there was also one
Oh,
called Mac and Chat.
That was awesome.
That was pretty good.
there's also mac and chat, mac and
Dragons.
So when is the next
Dinos, Dragons, and Donuts. That was that.
Dino
Taco
Nuggets!
Tuesdays?
You know, Dino!
No,
Dino
No, we
Nuggets!
did 3. We've done 3 now. Yeah. Dinos, Dragons, and Donuts.
Dino Nugget Day!
Taco Tuesdays
Yes!
and Mac and Chat.
Okay.
Dino Nugget Day!
Dino Nugget Day.
Dino Nugget!
Mac and Chat gets the top award.
No,
I like
Dino
Dino
Nugget Day.
Nuggets.
Me too.
Dino
I
Nugget
really
Day.
like
I'm
that.
making it real. I'm making it
All right, so I
real.
gotta ask though. If you had to pick between donuts and Dino Nuggets,
Dino Nuggets!
I like
what would it be?
Dino Nuggets! Dino Nuggets!
We're gonna have a new vote next week
Dino Nuggets stickers on my watch.
on the laptop, and it's gonna be tacos, Dino Nuggets, donuts, or mac and cheese.
Mac and cheese! All that!
And you guys can take your vote.
Mac and chat was the best.
Yeah, Mac and Chat was the best.
All right, guys. Tonight we're covering everything from Abraham to King David.
Wow.
Wow. Oh, my batteries were already dead on Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
Also, my water's in the kitchen.
Is there anything else
Yes,
that's going on?
Just get everything for you, Daniel.
Actually, wait. My adapter's gone.
You like the way we effect?
Quadruple A.
Daniel, you get away with the effect. It comes free.
Yep.
Someone did steal.
I just sat there. If you do anything, yeah, just started to run.
I'm not messing around.
Yeah, all
I just sat in the chair. Guys, somebody stole his adapter. Guys, did you hear that sound effect? It's like, Daniel, Jonathan, you stuck the ball. I guess
Jonathan, what was that sound effect?
Oh yeah, it lets you download messages plus Verizon.
Take that.
Snaggy McSnaggerson. It's me. Big
Verizon.
Bird. Yoink! Look at Bible. No, Snaggy McSnaggerson. Snaggy McSnaggerson. Get a Bible name. Big Bird. His nickname is Snaggy McSnaggerson. Wow. No, because it'll just take a little while to download. What? Nate. Look at your Bible.
Yes.
Go get your
I
Bible.
had like 50 members.
Big Bird, go get a Bible. Nate, go get a Bible. Nate,
Look at
Don't
in the middle.
jingle
the projector screen, please. You missed it. I watched you with my two hands.
Nate, you're a bad listener in and out of class. You're a bad listener in and you better read your Bible. You gotta read your Bible, okay? You better read your Bible. And read your Bible.
All right, guys.
Yeah, you are. But a really bad listener in and out of class.
As I said, we're covering everything from Abraham to King David. This is going to be 2004 BC up to 1004 BC.
What was that?
There's a Bible just finally falling over. It was a little crooked.
It's gonna be spider falling over.
Bryce, you're going to get a neck cramp. You sure you're okay with this? Okay.
Jesus is worth it.
He loves me.
Because I get to look at all
It's not like we're short on seats anymore. Bryce.
Alex,
All right, guys, here we go. Here's our timeline for tonight.
It's getting more complicated.
Calm down. Quiet down. If you have something worth saying, please raise your hand. If you deem it not worth raising your hand, it's also not worth saying. That's your own determination right there. So, first up, I want you to note that Noah only just dies. Only just finally dies. He's been alive this whole time. As does Job. His three sons, though, Noah's three sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, they're still alive. And actually, Ham outlives Abraham. Isn't that interesting?
roasted.
That's odd when you consider.
roasted ham.
One more time. Shh, you're not doing it. It's interesting to note that Ham outlives Abraham when you consider that Ham and Abraham are separated by like 7 or 8 generations. Generations. So if you had to attach the greats to great-grandfather, that would put, you know, Ham and Abraham next to each other, that would be like 6 or 7, or no, 6 greats. Great, 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 granduncle. Like that's ridiculous. It was 7. I'm bad at this. Counting is hard. All right, so we're going to start off with Abraham. He is notable because of the covenant that God gave him. Out of all the people on the earth, thousands and thousands and thousands by this point. Remember, we started back with only 8 people coming out of the flood. Now we're in the thousands and, you know, easily the millions at this point. God just picks Abraham. Just Abraham. All right, who wants to read Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3? You? Okay.
How long does Ham live out Abraham?
Outlive him by?
Yeah.
Let's see. Our scale down here, here's a faint green line. That's 100 years from here to here. So our scale, that's about 100. So I'd say somewhere in the 30, 40 years range. 30, 40 years. I mean, he lived a lot more years, just total. I think he lived close to 600 years. So, but that's just because Ham was born like way back on the past week. Yes.
Just imagine being Ham and how would be all of your children.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy. Pretty crazy.
Okay. 12 to 1.
It's chapter 12, the first 3 verses.
Okay. The Lord said to Abram,
Mm-hmm.
leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. Yeah, great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. And stop at 3. Continue.
Read 3.
I will bless those who bless you and curse those who pray with contempt.
Treat you with contempt. So like hatred.
All of the families on earth will be blessed through you.
Beautiful. Now that promise comes true in multiple phases and parts. He gives him the land eventually. His whole family gets Israel. They become the Israelites. But also that last piece of the promise, the all families on earth will be blessed through you, comes true when Jesus comes from the descendants of Abraham. But that's still 2,000 years away. Look at the timeline we're on here. Oh, I got my numbers wrong. I forgot to update them. My bad. This is supposed to be 1900 BC, 1800 BC, 1700 BC, 20. You know what I mean? Like we're 1,000 years off. I copied it from last week. My bad.
Hang on, Casey.
All right, so but yeah, the 2,000 thing I said is true. It's about 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus. So God gives this promise to him, and it doesn't come true for 2,000 years, but it does come true. And that's interesting that God's promises always come true, but that doesn't mean we understand the timing. All right, who wants to do chapter 17, verse 19? Just kind of breezing through Genesis. Skipping all the way from chapter 12 all the way up to chapter 17. By the way, the amount of skipping we're doing here is from when Abraham is 75. That was how old he was back in chapter 12. Okay, he has no kids at this point, and he's 75 years old. Nuts, right? And God says, I'm going to turn you into a nation. You're going to have so many descendants, you won't even be able to count them. And he's like, I'm old, and I have no kids. And God's like, no sweat, man. And then he waits.
And then he gets kids when he's 1,000 years old.
Oh, not 1,000, but we'll get there. All right, so chapter 17 rolls around, and this is like halfway from 75 years old to whenever he gets his kids, and I'll reveal that in a moment. But for now, just imagine we're like halfway there. Okay? Did you want to read?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it. Chapter 17, verse 19.
God replied, Sarah, your wife will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant.
Now, in these intermediate years where it's kind of halfway between the promise originating when he's 75 and him actually getting to finally have a son, he does a lot of things that are against God. He does a lot of things that are directly contradicting what God's been teaching him. He lies about stuff, he cheats on things, and at one point, he's so desperate to have a kid, because it's been years since the promise and he still hasn't had a kid, that his wife, seeing his desperation, says, why don't you just sleep with my servant girl, and she'll give you a kid. She starts to think that she's the problem because she's old too, his wife. And so God just says, no! I said you're going to have a kid, and I meant with Sarah, your wife. That's who I was talking about. So God reconfirms, don't go crazy on me here, Abraham. Abraham did actually go through with that plan. He did actually sleep with his wife's servant girl, and they actually did have a kid together. And God says, that's not the kid I was talking about. It's not a miracle if you get some 20-year-old girl pregnant. It's a miracle if you get your wife who's in her 90s pregnant. That's a miracle. So then we move down to chapter 18, and it's years after chapter 17. Who wants to read chapter 18, verse 10? Go for it.
Then one,
That's good. That's really good.
Way that way.
I wasn't looking up.
Go ahead.
then one of them said, I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening to this conversation.
That's all of 10. There's a short verse.
No, that was.
Did I chop it?
No, it was, yeah, and then it said Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent.
Oh, okay. I accidentally chopped it. Yeah, Sarah, by the way, when she hears that, she laughs. Because when Abraham gets that said to him by God, he's 99. It has almost been 25 years since the promise. He's 99 going on 100.
And how old's the wife at this point?
She's always, I think, 10 years younger than Abraham. So he's 99, she's 89. So he's going to be 100. She's going to be 90 when she finally gives birth. Crazy. And sure enough, the promise comes true. 1 year later, they have a kid. They name him Isaac. He's the kid of promise. So you can kind of see on here, Abraham's way up here. This is Sarah, his wife. This is Abraham's nephew Lot. This is Ishmael, the son he had with her servant girl. And so there's all this time between here and when Isaac is born. And this is exactly 100 years after that. It's when Abraham is 100 years old. He finally gives birth to Isaac. Now, continuing this trend of you don't get to have kids until you're crazy old, Isaac also waits a very long time. He's like in his 50s by the time he finally has kids. And he has twins. They're the next ones we're going to be looking at on the timeline.
I love
Jacob
this story.
and Esau. All right, so Jacob and Esau. These two are born as twins, but they couldn't be more different. Once they came out, one was already hairy from birth. The other one, pale and hairless. So immediately when they're born, you can tell the difference. And as they grow up, the differences continue. One of them grows up to be a hunter. Guess which one?
The hairy one.
The hairy one. He grows up to be a hunter. He's an outdoorsman. He likes to go and shoot deer and kill them and bring them home and barbecue them, and it's fantastic.
Yes.
And the other one likes to stay near the house and let his sheep graze in the field and be nice to them and occasionally barbecue them too. As this continues through the years, the dad, Isaac, starts to have an affinity and a closer relationship with the hairy one who hunts. His name is Esau. And the mom starts to have a closer relationship with the one who is clean-shaven and raises sheep and stays home a lot. And his name is Jacob. As this continues, since Esau came out first, he's considered the older son. Even though they're twins, that actually carries weight in their culture. You were supposed to have a double inheritance. So if there's only two of you, that means literally you get 2/3 of everything your parents had when they die, and your brother gets 1/3. If there's like, 4 of you, then you get 2/5, and everybody else gets 1/5. Isn't that weird? Then it doesn't really matter, does it? You get a really sharp axe. I don't know. All right, so Esau and Jacob are always at odds. And at one point, after everything has gotten pretty darn bad, Jacob gets told by his mom, you're not going to get much of anything. Your brother's going to get the blessing. Your brother's going to get the double inheritance. Your brother's going to get it all. You got to act fast. And he's like, I don't really care, Mom. And she says, no, you got to care about this. This is a big deal. So she talks him into going and tricking old Isaac. And at this point, I think we're right around here, Isaac is getting just over 100 himself. And Isaac is going blind. And so Mom says, hey, if you talk in a gruff voice and you go in there and pretend to be Esau, he'll bless you like you're Esau. He'll give you the older brother blessing. And he'll promise the double inheritance and all that stuff. It'll all be bottled up in you, and your brother can't have it that way. And he says, yeah, I don't think this plan's going to work. I'm really smooth skinned. I don't have a lot of hair on my arms. If Dad so much as brushes up against me, it doesn't matter that he's blind. He's going to immediately feel a smooth arm and go, wait a second. That's not Esau. Esau is hairy from head to toe. I can't pull this off, Mom. And so she says, well, we'll go ahead, just kill a goat and bring in the goat to me. I'll show you what we're going to do. So they cook the goat, and they take the goat skin and they tie it onto his arms. So that when Dad bumps into him, he'll feel a hairy son and go, well, I guess it is Esau. So the whole plan goes through, and Dad actually is super suspicious, even though he's blind and he's super old, and he doesn't just bump in to Jacob. He says, come here. I want to feel your arms. And so he does, and apparently the goat hair passes for Esau, and that tells you how hairy Esau is. If you can pass as a goat, you are a hairy individual. That is very hairy. After all this happens, Esau comes back. He was hunting. He barbecues a deer. He brings it into his dad. He's like, Dad, I want my blessing today. And he's like, who are you? It's like, I'm your son. Your eldest son, the only one who can come in here asking for a blessing by right, that's, me. He's like, but you were just here. And suddenly everything clicks into place. They both realize what happened. They're both pretty upset, but Isaac knows once you bless someone, you can't just retract the blessing. You can't just pull it off of them. You bless them, they're blessed. That's it. You gotta be careful when people say this. Careful who you say that to. It's a bigger deal than you realize. So Esau starts to slightly freak out about this. Let's go ahead and read. Who wants to read Genesis chapter 27, verses 36 through 38? Lulu, go for it. Chapter 27, verse 36, 37, and 38.
Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob, for now he has cheated his wife. First he has taken my rights as the firstborn, and now he has stolen my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved even one blessing for me? Isaac said to Esau, I have made Jacob your master, and I have declared that all his brothers will be his servants. I have guaranteed him an abundance of grain and wine. What is left for me to give to you, my son? Esau pleaded, but do you have only one blessing? Oh, my father, bless me too. Then Esau broke down and wept.
And his father does go on to give him a blessing, but the blessing is bittersweet. It's basically that you'll be amazing in this world, but you'll always be second place to him. That's the blessing. You'll be better than a lot of people, but not your brother. It's a pretty harsh blessing. And so Esau's bitter about it. He's not just sad, he gets mad. Who wants to read chapter 27, a little further down, verse 41? Anybody? Anybody? All right, Nathan.
From what time on Esau hated Jacob because the father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to speak. I will soon be mourning my father's death when I recoup my brother Jacob.
Yeah, he thought he'd be soon mourning his father's death. It turned out his father's going to live for like several more decades. Several more.
How many?
But yeah,
How
he
old is he?
at this point he's around 100, 110, and he lives to. I'll double check the spreadsheet later. I didn't memorize it. I think he goes to like 160. It's nuts.
I thought it was 180.
Hmm?
I thought you said 180.
It's possible. You have a better memory than me. I did just tell her this earlier today, so maybe it was 180. You could look up the spreadsheet.
I want to live to 180.
Say again.
How can people live to like so old?
We actually did talk about this last week. If you missed it, there's several theories on this, but the leading one is that the radiation that the sun shoots at the Earth all the time is one of the leading causes of cell degradation, the reason you can only live to a certain point. And pre-flood and very slightly post-flood, the atmosphere would have been crazy different than it is now. And it would have likely blocked a lot more of those rays. So cells wouldn't break down as much every time they multiply back then as they do now. They break down a lot every time they multiply, which puts a cap on our life. God also said at the point of the flood, I don't really want anyone to live past 120. And so, as it turns out, Esau and Jacob are the last two people on the planet who lived over 120. That's it. After them, no one else does it. Moses makes it right to 120, and that's it. That's the end for him. And then no one else has really made it ever since. Yeah.
It was 180.
Oh, dang. Good find. Thank you.
I was
35.
I don't know why.
Science.
All right. So, Jacob, oh, I missed this part. Remember how he says, no wonder his name is Jacob? Jacob is Hebrew, two words mashed together. It's heel and catcher. So like person who catches things. So heel catcher. This is because when they were born, Esau was born first, but Jacob grabs his heel and like pulls on it as they're being born. And as a baby, that doesn't sound that violent because you can't pull on anything that hard. But they named him heel catcher as like an homage to how he was born. And now you think about it when you're an adult, why would you grab someone's heel? Well, to trip them. That's why you would do it as an adult. So it was like a cutesy baby name that he was given. And now his brother's saying, this wasn't some cutesy baby name, that's a prophecy. He's been tripping me up his whole life. And so he says, no wonder he's called Jacob. So that's why he says that. Then after this starts to go down and everyone can see like Esau is going to kill Jacob eventually. This is not going well. There's also another flip side in this. They're living in a place far, far away from their distant relatives. It's like all their cousins and uncles and grandpas and everyone else lives distance-wise very far away. And so everyone around where they are is not anything like them. They don't have the same culture as them. They don't worship God like they do. Everything about them is different. And Esau starts marrying women from that culture, and he falls into their ways. He starts worshiping false idols. He starts doing things like them. And both parents, both Isaac and their mom, both agree, we don't want that for Jacob. We don't want him to marry a local girl and get sucked into this local culture and these local religions. We want him to go back up to the country where we came from and go find a wife up there. So they send Jacob off in verse 5 of chapter 28. Let's read that one. Go for it. Sorry guys, I'm looking around for people who haven't read yet. If you haven't caught on, that's kind of my method.
So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan
Nailed it.
with his uncle
Laban.
his mother's brother, the son of Bethuel.
Very nice. Cool. That's all just telling you about who they're related to. If you go back into the earlier part of Genesis, it tells you everyone down from Noah and how they split off with his 3 boys and who's related to who country-wise. And so this is not important if you don't care, but if you want to know who they're related to from Noah's descendants, that tells you. All right, so Jacob goes off. He finds a wife. He decides he wants to marry her. Laban is like this super crafty uncle. He's like, yeah, you can totally marry her. The price is going to be 7 years of work. And Jacob is so in love. He's like, sure, fine, whatever, I'll do it. So he works his 7 years. He's like, yeah, finally, yay, marriage time. And they go to have the wedding, and the dad, Laban, gets him super drunk, and Jacob marries the wrong girl while he's drunk.
Oh,
Doesn't realize it. Wakes up the next morning, and he has slept with his brand new bride, and it's not the girl he fell in love with. It's her older sister. Super awkward. I don't even know how Dad talked her into that one. I just can't. Even.
Imagine how he woke up.
He goes angry to Laban. He's like, "What have you done? I just married the wrong girl, and it's your fault, clearly." And he's like, hey, don't get mad at me. It's normal around here that the oldest sister has to get married first. You can't go marrying off the younger sister before the older sister. That'd be weird. He's like, you don't know what's weird is me marrying the wrong girl because you got me drunk. So he says, okay, it's cool. You can totally marry the younger sister now. But, if you want 2 wives, it costs you twice as much as 1 wife. So, you're going to have to work another 7 years. Right? That's fair. If we're being fair here, fair. So he actually lets him marry the other gal on the promise of 7 more years of work. And so now he has 2 wives, one he did not ask for, and the one he asked for, and 7 years of indentured servitude left. During that time, he manages to ask for small changes to his pay during that 7 years. He asks for all the goats that are born with this really weird fur color be given to him. And all the sheep, if it's a weird fur color like this, then they're mine. If they're normal and pretty looking, then they're yours, Laban. And Laban's like, sweet, I will take that deal. You are paid in weird looking animals. Perfect. Okay, so for 7 years, paid in weird looking animals. And God works a miracle and makes most of the animals be born that way. And after a little bit of time goes by, Laban notices, like, my servant guy, Jacob, has more animals now than I do. We got to change the terms of this agreement. So he goes back to me. He's like, we got to change this up. Something's going wrong with this. I want the weird looking ones, and you can keep the ones you already got. But from now on, anything that's born looking in that weird fur color, I get them. And if they are born looking like this, then you get them. And they change the agreement, and lo and behold, it's another miracle. And now most of them are being born in Jacob's color. This goes on and on and on. 7 years are up. Jacob is a very rich man, and so he's paid back for this trickery that Laban plays on him. As he goes to leave, he kind of sneaks out, because after 14 years of this, getting richer than your master shenanigan, Laban is not a happy man. He is not happy. And on top of that, all the other guys that work for Laban are super steamed, because their pay hasn't gone up or down or changed at all. They're all getting just barely by, and Jacob is getting filthy rich. And so Jacob decides after 14 years, we're out of here. And so he goes to leave. Laban chases. There's this whole big feud thing. And as he's coming back towards home after 14 years of being away, he realizes, wait a second, was there another reason I left besides marrying a girl not from around there? What was wrong back at home again? I don't remember. Oh, that's right. My brother wants me dead. I forgot about that. So he's like, okay, I know what I'll do. I'm so stinking rich, I'll just send presents first. So I'll walk home as slow as I possibly can, and I'll just send drove after drove of stuff that I've earned and bought and acquired, and I'll just send it with servants, because now he's even got servants. I'm going to send them all on ahead, and I'll just have them sent with the message of, this is for Esau, my master. And so he sends on package after package. And the package, when I say that, is like hundreds of animals walking in a group with a servant at the front leading them. And then hundreds of other animals walking in a group with a servant leading them. And it just goes on and on and on. There's goats and donkeys and sheep and horses and cattle and all this crazy stuff. And he finally gets to meet Esau. And Esau isn't angry. And it's not because of the gifts. He says, take it all. Interesting. I never noticed this because the Bible doesn't really like flat out mention it. By the time this happens, Isaac's not dead yet. Because of how long Isaac is going to live, it never dawned on me that he would still be alive at this point. Because remember back when they split, Esau's like, I'll be mourning for my dad real soon. Then, after I've buried him, then I'll go kill Jacob. So in my mind, I'm thinking like, Isaac's going to die soon. But with the timeline, it becomes very clear. Isaac's still alive. He has not died yet. And so Esau's had time, apart from his brother, to soften, to grow his own family, to grow his own wealth, to become a rich man in his own right. And his dad's blessing of you'll be better than a lot of people, just not your brother, has come true. And he is. He's richer than almost everyone, except for Jacob. And so Esau's not mad at his brother anymore. Pretty cool. They make up. They live near each other for the rest of who knows how long, until Joseph comes on the scene. Now, as we get towards Joseph, you got to realize the family tree has broadened. Because not only is Jacob married to the first two women, the one he meant to and the one he didn't mean to, he's now also married to two more women. Each of them have a handmaiden. There's a big problem with having two wives.
Really? No way. 2 or 4 wives.
Two wives produce kids, both of them, and now there's like a competition for dad's love. And you don't feel like you're part of the same family. Even though you're technically part of the same family, you don't feel like you're part of the same family. You all have different moms. And so, in this race to be more loved by the father of the family, Jacob, the wives pull out all the stops. They're like, I can only have a kid every 9 months. I gotta do better than this. So they each grab a servant girl and say, marry her too. And so now Jacob has 4 women that he's married to. And they're all having kids. And eventually, this is not an exaggeration, he ends up with 12 boys.
Boys?
1 daughter.
Daughter.
Yeah, Dinah. You guys ever heard about how older brothers are really protective of their older sister? Yeah.
As a backstory.
It's not a story we're going to read tonight, but just remember, 12 brothers, 1 sister. That sister's looked out for. A lot. All right, so Joseph is the second youngest out of all 12 brothers. That means by the time he's born, there's already 10 other brothers. And interestingly, he's the firstborn of the one woman Jacob actually meant to marry. So in all this bickering and fighting to be favorite, the one woman that he wanted to marry most didn't have a kid until after every other wife was done having kids. Isn't that crazy? And so Joseph instantly skyrocketed to being the favorite. Because when he was born, he was the first and for a while the only son of the already favorite wife. Now you've got the favorite wife, has a son, boom, instant favorite status. What does that do? That means you've got 10 people that want you to not exist.
Why didn't they do that in the beginning? Why didn't they want to kill all the other brothers?
Oh,
That would be a little like all of the other
that's pretty hard to live with, as we're going to find out. Who wants to read Genesis chapter 37, verses 18 through 20? Anybody who hasn't read yet? All right, Brianne.
Chapter what?
Chapter 37, verses 18 through 20.
7. Wow.
Yeah, we're skipping along here. It moves fast because you go for the highlights and the bullet
Chapter
points.
37.
Verses 18 through 20.
18 through 20. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these
Cisterns. It's like a dried up well.
We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten it. What? A wild animal. I never knew that's how that started. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. And then...
That's it. Stop for there.
I never knew that.
So, make a long story short, because this is a very long story. Basically, Joseph's story goes all the way from chapter 37 to the end of Genesis. Like chapter 50. Okay, so it's a rather long story. There's a few pauses where it'll like flip back to the rest of the family and see how they're doing for a bit, but like they get a chapter at most. It's mostly about Joseph. So Joseph gets thrown in the pit as planned, but they don't kill him. They say that he was killed by wild animals. That part's still true. That part of the plan doesn't change. But while one of the brothers who actually wants to rescue him goes off, the other 9, if you're keeping your math going, decide, let's not kill him and be guilty of murder, but let's still get rid of him. So let's sell him as a slave. They see some traveling traders walking by, and they say, how much you give us for a strapping young lad of 17? And they pay him, and then Joseph is 17 years old. Joseph is sold into slavery. Those traders then go all the way to Egypt from Israel and sell him as a slave. The person who buys him is Potiphar. He is the captain of the king, well, Pharaoh's guard. And he is now employed in Potiphar's house. Now, he stays in Potiphar's house for years. It's not a short time. And so, as you read the story in the Bible, it doesn't tell you how many years he's in each place. It doesn't tell you how long the journey took from Israel to Egypt. And so you really have to puzzle this stuff out by the milestones they do give you, like when his kids are born, and how many years the famine lasted, and those kinds of things. So basically, he's in Potiphar's house for roughly 12 years at the most, maybe 10 years at the least. Okay? So he lives out a decade or more of his life as a slave in Potiphar's house. Now, during that time, the same thing that was true of his dad, where he's working with sheep and goats and somehow God finds a way to bless him and make him rich. That kind of blessing rests on Joseph too. And it's not just random happenstance. It's because Joseph loves God and he tries to do the right thing at all times. And God pays him back for it. So as he's a slave in Potiphar's house, you're like, how can God pay him back with riches when he's a slave? Like that's not supposed to work. You're a slave. You don't even get paid as a slave. You just do the work so you don't die. Like how does that work? Well, God does it. God makes everything that Joseph works at come out perfect. So much so that Potiphar can't ignore it. It's hard to miss. And so Potiphar ends up promoting him from like bottom rung slave to next rung slave to next rung to next rung to next rung. So he's got a job that no slave should ever do. He's in charge of everything for Potiphar. So Potiphar doesn't have to lift a finger. Eventually, Joseph is running the entire household, the whole everything at his house. All the animals, all the other servants, all the meals, everything goes through Joseph. He is the head manager of one of the richest guys in the country's house. And that's not a job a slave usually holds. That's usually a family position. That's like your eldest son or the son that still lives at home kind of a job, not a slave that you picked up from some travelers and he comes from a country you've never even been to. That is not a job you give that guy. And so that's how God blesses him. He stops being the manual labor, do all the grunt work slave, and he starts being the, you're in charge of everything and your master really legitimately likes you. That's pretty cool. As slavery goes, that's one of the best jobs I could possibly imagine. Now, the other problem is that he's actually quite handsome. And as he starts working in these higher jobs, he's in the house more. And since he's handsome and in the house more, that means that as Potiphar's off at work with the Pharaoh, Joseph is left at home, and so is Potiphar's wife. And so Potiphar's wife starts trying to get Joseph to sleep with her. And Joseph, being an honest man, a good man, just says no. And at first that's enough. Eventually she gets desperate and she tries to rope him in by grabbing onto his coat and pulling him into bed with her. It's creepy. It is downright creepy.
Why do you sound like a horror movie?
At this point, he is desperate to get away. He does not want her. He does not want to be caught with her like this. Because if he is caught like this, even though he's not trying to do anything, it won't matter. He's in her bedroom, he's being held onto. Everyone's just going to make assumptions. So he wriggles out of his shirt and just books it. Now he is leaving Potiphar's wife's room shirtless at a run. That don't look good for him. But maybe no one would have noticed, except she starts screaming like he tried to sleep with her. And everyone comes running, and she tells her story with tears, and people listen. And now Potiphar has a choice. Do I trust Joseph that I know would never do this, and make my wife a laughingstock amongst all the royals, or do I punish Joseph wrongfully, I don't think he did this, so that my family keeps their name, keeps their honor, keeps that image that everyone has of us? And that's what Potiphar chooses. But rather than have him put to death like would be normal for a slave, when this kind of crime was actually true, he actually throws Joseph into prison, something he was in charge of. And so he had a hand in keeping track of Joseph, even though he made it look like he punished Joseph, because he did. Joseph then is stuck in prison for however long he's in prison, he ends up being such a good prisoner, such a model prisoner, that the guy who's in charge of the prison starts promoting him, a prisoner, to be in charge of everything in the prison, and the prison, like, master, the jail guard guy, he just kind of like tells Joseph to do stuff, and then Joseph does all the work. In prison. He's now co-warden as a prisoner. Are you guys kind of getting the picture of how Joseph's life is going? People will do the worst possible thing to Joseph, and God then does the best possible thing for Joseph. Again and again and again. So then, while he's there, he interprets some dreams for some guys who were thrown in prison by Pharaoh. One of them ends up being guilty, one of them ends up being innocent. So one of them ends up being put to death, and one of them ends up getting set free. As he's set free, Joseph says, hey, tell Pharaoh about me and how I'm, actually kind of innocent, and I'm just in here through circumstance. And maybe Pharaoh will pardon me and I can get out of here. And the guy goes free, and he's so overjoyed, and he's so scared to be back in the presence of Pharaoh, he completely forgets. He doesn't tell Pharaoh a darn thing about Joseph until one day when Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh's like, man, I wish someone could interpret these dreams. And then that guy's like, oh wait, I know a guy. Let me see if he's still alive. I think he's still alive. He was in prison last I saw him. And Pharaoh's like, you want some guy in prison to help me out? And so eventually, yeah, Joseph comes out of prison. He helps the Pharaoh out. Joseph so impresses the Pharaoh, not just with the dream interpretation, but with just his general wisdom about what you should do to keep things running smoothly, like a business or a country. Pharaoh immediately promotes him. And I do mean immediately. That's the weird part. He goes from prisoner out of jail for a day to second in command of the country. And he runs the country for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just tells him what he wants done. And then Joseph gets everything done for the Pharaoh. How ridiculous is that? Crazy. From slave to prisoner to politician. And second in command at every stop. Once he's there, there is a 7-year crazy, awesome, good farming time where everything is growing bountifully. And Joseph is smart, and he keeps back all these extra supplies during that time. And then there's going to be a 7-year famine. This was what was in Pharaoh's dream. Joseph knows this, and so 2 years into the famine, not only is everyone in Egypt having to come to Joseph for food, and he's having to hand it out carefully, making sure that he doesn't give it all away at the start, and then they die at the end of the 7-year famine. He's carefully doing this. 2 years in, other countries are starting to perish. Other countries around Egypt are all starting to suffer and starve, and some of them are dying. And even Joseph's brothers, way back in Israel, are going through the same problem. And so they hear through the grapevine over the 2 years, somehow Egypt isn't dying. They're still having a famine. They still have like almost no rainfall. The Nile isn't flooding its banks like it's supposed to every year. And yet they're not dead. Because some guy in Egypt has food enough for everybody. And if you've got stuff to trade, you can go get food from this guy in Egypt. How crazy does that sound, right? So all the oldest brothers, not the youngest, because guess what? The youngest is now the new favorite, because the dad thinks Joseph's dead. So the new youngest is the new favorite. The other 10 older brothers who got Joseph into this mess all go off to Egypt to try and buy stuff. Joseph has some serious fun at first and doesn't tell them it's him. Because now he speaks like an Egyptian, he dresses like an Egyptian, he looks like an Egyptian, he probably walks like an Egyptian. They don't notice it's him. So he just plays along, he speaks to them through an interpreter. He speaks Egyptian to the interpreter speaks like Hebrew, Aramaic, or whatever to his brothers, and they don't figure it out. And so he just messes with them. He pretends he thinks they're spies, and he's all suspicious, so they're going to get punished. He throws one of them in jail just for fun. He makes him go back home and get the younger brother and bring the younger brother back. And they're like, dude, there's no way our dad's going to let us do this. And he's like, well, take some food with you. I wouldn't want you to stop. So he sends back food. They go get the younger brother after having to basically come right up to starvation before dad says, I will let you go. Which means the one that Joseph stuck in jail was now in jail for like a while because they're just spinning their wheels back at home. They finally come back with Benjamin. And he finally spills the beans. But not before he scares him to death a few more times. He was having a lot of fun. He finally spills the beans here in Genesis chapter 45. So you can see a lot of chapters have gone by now. A lot of years have gone by. Genesis chapter 45. Who wants verses 4 and 5? Alex, go for it.
Please come closer, he said to him. So they came closer, and he said to him, I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold in slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry,
yourself starting in this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives.
So at that final point, after he's had a little bit of fun, he's fully willing to forgive them. Just let it all go. Why? Not because he's just so darn nice and forgiving, it's because he saw the big picture. He saw what God was doing. God was working through their hatred. Wild, right? And he ends up saving his whole family, who at this point have had bunches of kids. Their whole family is, I think, 75, 80 people at this point. From the 12 sons and mom and dad and mom and mom. Now they've got like 75-ish people. You can look it up. The number's actually in there. I just don't remember off the top of my head. Anyways, now we move past Joseph. Joseph lives for a while. Jacob lives for a while. Jacob dies in Egypt. They go back home to bury him in Israel. Joseph dies in Egypt. He's like, please bury me in Israel too. But then he gets left there, dead body left there for like, buried in Egypt for a long time, because they don't really leave Egypt for a while. So notice on this on the timeline here, there's a big gap between Joseph dying and Moses being born, and during that time, slavery.
Yeah.
It's catching. It's not just Joseph. How many were they, Jeremiah?
Total number of his direct descendants was 66. It says altogether there were 7 members of Jacob's family.
Cool. There we go. Oh yeah, because one of the wives already died. So the parentage is only 4 people at this point. 3 wives. Yeah. Okay. So who wants to read Exodus chapter 1, verse 8? Bryce. Lead us through this several hundred-year gap, please.
Just verse 8.
Just verse 8.
Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt, who knew nothing about Joseph and what he had done.
Boom. After that, they all get scared about the same thing that Laban was scared about way back with Jacob. Dang it, everything I do, Jacob just gets richer than me and prospers more than me. No matter what I change, he prospers more. Why was that? Because he was worshiping God. And so the same thing happens in Egypt. Joseph's family, his brother's family, they're worshiping God in Egypt. And as they continue to just live alongside the Egyptians, work alongside the Egyptians, somehow they're prospering more than the Egyptians are prospering. As a consequence, their numbers, their children count starts going faster than the Egyptians. They have more resources to feed more mouths. They start having more kids. The Egyptians are growing at the same old rate, and somehow Jacob's family starts growing faster. Now this is the turning point where it goes from Jacob's family to Israel, because Jacob got renamed Israel, and now they're bigger than a family. You just can't call them a family anymore. They're a nation. And so since it used to be Jacob's family and then it was Israel's family, now they're bigger than a family, now they're just called Israel. Just Israel. And so the king that doesn't know what Joseph did for them, why they're even in his land in the first place, just says, you know what? To heck with that. Let's enslave all of them, and all of their fast growing and good at working will just become a boon for us. They'll just become our servants, and everything they do will help us out.
Have they not learned the lesson yet that no matter what?
No, because they forgot Joseph. They forgot Joseph. They don't remember that. It's too many generations away.
Wow.
We're talking several kings down the line. Yeah.
So
If you forget it, you're doomed to repeat it. That's how it goes.
So Israel was a person, right? Or he was renamed Israel.
Yeah.
And then there was a family, but then they got so big that it was
Nation.
like a nation called Israel.
Called Israel. Isn't that great? That's
and
how it
so
works.
that turned into Israel.
Yeah.
And the actual town is so
Well, it's
all
a country,
those people,
not a town.
country,
But yeah,
whatever.
At this point, though, they're living in someone else's country. That's the weird part. The land and the people are separate at this stage in the story. So the people are down in Egypt. The country is still called Canaan because the Israelites haven't gone there yet. Does that make sense?
So everyone in Israel was related?
Distantly, but yes. Remember, 4 moms started the family. So actually not that related. Does that make sense? They're only related by dad at the very top generation. Well, not direct cousins. That's like, so you're stretching the word cousin. Several times removed. So the way it works is Laban is
This is Jacob's mom's brother.
So that would just be cousin, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cousin. Yep. And then the two servant girls have no relation as far as
That's true.
yeah. So they help to mix up the bloodline. But as long as you keep track of your family history, which they did, you can avoid this.
Yeah.
Besides, the original one. Can't help that. Okay, who wants to read Exodus chapter 2, verse 6? Go, Lulu, go!
When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. Her little boy was crying, and she felt sorry. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said.
Now, the reason why this verse is in here is because all the way from chapter 1, verse 8, down to chapter 2, verse 6, we've crossed from this point to this point. We've gone almost 100 years of slavery in. And now what's happening is the slaves are too numerous. The slaves are too powerful. The slaves are too many. What are we going to do? And so the Pharaoh at that point makes up another law. Not just Israel is now all slaves, but Israel can only have girls. If a boy is born, you got to kill it.
You don't get to choose.
What?
Sad.
You can just repeal the law when they have few enough slaves, and you can just keep enforcing and repealing and just kind of keep the level right where you want.
Well, I mean, no, then they mix with the Egyptian bloodline.
And then they stop being Israelites and having an identity and being separate from the Egyptians and a people who don't want what the Egyptians want. It's a rather crafty plan if it works. The problem is the midwives won't have it. The midwives cheat. They get there, they deliver the baby, and then they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get there in time." They just say they didn't get there in time. Like, I didn't see what gender it was. I wasn't there. Whoops. Because the midwives are all about preserving the life of the baby, keeping the baby and the mom alive. They're not going to, kill the babies. Because that's who Pharaoh wanted to enforce the law. He wanted Pharaoh Pharaoh wanted the midwives to be there when the baby's born and go, "Oh, it's a boy, let's kill it." Well, the midwives didn't. That's the answer. They didn't do it. All right, so Moses is born. He's a boy. And his mom has this idea, because, maybe I can keep him. She hides him. But eventually, as he gets older and older, he stops looking like a girl by just wrapping him in a pink blanket. There's a point where that doesn't work anymore. And so she sticks him in a basket, floats him down the river, and just says, "God, he's in your hands." And then she's like, "Okay, this is actually really scary." And she makes his older sister go watch him as he washes downstream. "Can you just make sure he doesn't die? I can't bear to watch." And so sister follows. Princess, daughter of Pharaoh, ends up finding the basket and opening it. Daughter of Pharaoh knows exactly what's going on and has pity on the baby and raises him, even though she knows he's an Israelite. Crazy, right? So she raises him. He's raised in the palace. He's raised as royalty, even though pretty much everyone who's older than Moses knows, she wasn't pregnant for 9 months. His skin looks different. He's an Israelite. But they all go along with it. Princess said it must be, so it must be. So he's raised as royal. He eventually commits murder. He kills a slave master as he sees a slave master whipping and beating an Israelite. And then because he's now a murderer, he gets freaked, he runs, and he goes off away. I'm kind of paraphrasing because we're running out of time here. So that's Exodus 2:15. He leaves the country. He's 40 years old when he leaves the country. He stays out of the country for 40 years. When he's 80 years old, God calls him back with the burning bush and says, "Hey, I got a job for you. Your people need rescuing. Get back to Egypt." Moses at first is like, "Heck no." And God basically says, "I'm God. What are you going to do? You going to avoid me?" So he talks him into it. Moses goes back. He takes his brother, Aaron. Let's see, which verse do I have?
Isn't it his wife?
Yeah, he's married now. He's got kids. 40 years went by. Stuff happens. And, okay, so here we go. It's towards the end. He goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let us go make a sacrifice in the wilderness." This is like a test for Pharaoh. You say, yes, you can worship God. God's like, "Cool, I like you, Pharaoh." You say, "No, you're not allowed to worship God." God's like, "Pharaoh, you should have chosen something else, man. This ain't good." So Pharaoh does not choose go worship God. He does not pick that. God starts kind of whittling away at Pharaoh and saying, "All right, how about now? How about now?" And he does this 10 times with 10 progressively worse plagues that fall only on the Egyptians and somehow perfectly miss the Israelites every time. I mean, we're talking everything from like you can't drink the water, which I mean, that's bad, to there's flies everywhere. Everywhere. You go to bed, there's flies. You go to the bathroom, there's flies. You open your fridge, they don't have fridges. There's flies everywhere. You can't move without there being flies. And you're like, dude, there's nothing worse than flies everywhere. And then God's like, what's that you say? How about frogs everywhere? Dang it! Now everything squishes when I walk. Everywhere there's frogs. But you know what are good about frogs? They eat flies. It's really good. There's like lice everywhere, and just like, please, I just want to take my skin off. It itches so bad. And God just keeps going and stacking it up. And every time Moses goes back to Pharaoh, it's like, how about now? Can we go worship God now?
No.
Pharaoh's just getting madder. No, you can't go worship God. He tells the slave masters, work them harder. Make it worse. Punish them. And God just keeps stacking it up. And there's a point when Pharaoh finally breaks. And that's when God says, okay, I gave him 9 chances. We're on number 10. This is going to be the last one. I'm going to pull out the punishment he can't not give into. We kill the firstborn child. Everyone in Egypt. Unless that family says, I'm not with Pharaoh, I'm with God. And follows the instructions that God passes out. The instructions are, make lamb for dinner. Take the blood from the lamb you kill, put it on your doorpost. I'll go right past your house. No one in your house dies. You're too poor, you can't afford a lamb, just go bunk up with someone. Spend the night in their living room. It'll still work. It will show to me you're on my side, not Pharaoh's side. Anyone could have done this. Israelite, Egyptian didn't matter. Most of the Egyptians did not do this. The Israelites all did this. God goes through that night, and it says there is wailing throughout the land. Because every Egyptian family is woken to the sounds of their oldest child dying. This is a huge knock-on effect when you start thinking about it. Because in a family, the oldest son might be the oldest son, but so might dad. He might be his dad's oldest son. Crazy, right?
No.
And so in families, sometimes the dad and the oldest son are both dead. In other families, it's just the oldest son. But I mean, it just ripples through the land, and people are just dying all over the place. Even Pharaoh's oldest son dies. And that's when Pharaoh just says, get out.
Pharaoh, what wasn't Pharaoh the firstborn?
You would think, right? You would think. Somehow that didn't track.
Maybe Pharaoh just put the lamb with his.
I think the way they do it in the movie kind of works for me. Negative. We're trying to finish. I think the way the movie kind of works for me, the way the movie does it, is that Moses is the oldest son in that family. That's the way that the movie does it. I don't know if that's legit. The Bible doesn't say that. But, you know, if that's the way it is, it kind of works. Anyways, technicality. Because Moses wasn't the firstborn in his own family, like his actual blood family. That was Aaron. Anyways, all that aside, they eventually get to leave. There's other details we're watching over. But as they leave, they're moving towards the land that God has set up for them. It takes them like a year to get there. They wander a bit. And when they finally get there, God's like, okay, go in, conquer. It's yours. Every battle you fight, I'm just going to win it for you. Just go. It's all yours. It's like a playground. Take the whole place. And they're like, we should be smart about this, though. We should send in spies. And God's like, no, just go. Just go. It's yours. I'm telling you it's yours. I'm like, we're going to send in spies. They send in spies. Spies come back. They're like, dude, everyone in there is buff. This is not going to go good. Everyone is just ripped. They're taller than us. They're stronger than us. Their cities are big and fortified. We're not going to make it. And they're like, oh, I don't know, guys. I don't think we can make it. What about Egypt? Egypt was nice. They had water in Egypt, like a Nile River. This place is kind of deserty. I don't know if I want this. This doesn't sound so good. And God says, you can go now, or you can completely miss out on this. And they say, we don't want to go. And God says, okay, you can go spin your wheels in the desert for 40 years. And they do. During 40 years in the desert, Moses actually does like one really big bad thing wrong. And God says, Moses, when the 40 years are up and the rest of everybody gets to go into Israel, you don't get to go. Neither does Aaron. You guys messed up big time. And so their protege, Joshua, he gets to lead everybody in. Joshua does so. Joshua leads everyone in. They conquer. And yet, there's like a flaw. Joshua does not actually conquer everyone. He tells the armies, go conquer everyone. And the armies are like, yeah, but like some of their women are pretty. So like maybe we shouldn't conquer them. Maybe we should like let someone live. That'd be fun, right? And Joseph's like, no, go get them out of here. Kick them out of the country. God's like, if you don't kick them out of the country, this is not going to go well. And they didn't kick them out of the country. They didn't kill them. It did not go well. As a consequence, they go through this horrible time called the time of the judges, where consecutively people get worse the whole time, and the people who come to save them are basically worse than the last guy the whole time. Everything just gets worse and worse and worse until utter depravity at the end. Samuel's the guy who finally rescues them and like pulls the nose of the plane up at the very, very end. And after Samuel, then the people are like, you know what? We don't want to do this judge thing anymore. We don't want to do this listen to God thing anymore. We want a king. We want a king with a crown, just like all the other countries. All the other big countries have kings. We want a king. And God's like, fine, you can have a king, but it's going to suck. You sure you still want a king? They're like, yeah, we want a king. And so God gives them a king. Guess what? It sucks. It's horrible. The king listens to God for like the first year or two, and then he immediately stops listening to God. He starts cheating on things. God's like, kill everyone in this village. They were horrible, evil people. And he goes there. And God's like, oh, and kill all the animals too. Take nothing. Just burn the whole thing to the ground. And he goes there and he kills all the people and he keeps the king alive and takes the king home and he takes the animals home. And God's like, what'd you do? I did exactly what you asked, God, except I kept the king alive and I kept the animals alive. That's not what I asked. Yeah, but I did exactly what you asked, except for I kept the king alive and I kept the animals alive. God gives him a few more chances. He doesn't take them. He's worse every time. And he slowly starts to go mad. And it gets even worse than disobeying God as he starts to try and kill people that are very close to him. And eventually, the baton passes on to a kid named David. And you guys mostly know about David. David kills Goliath. David's anointed before he actually gets to take the throne. Once David's a bit older, right here at this little black line where Saul dies, David finally gets to become king. But not before David had two opportunities to easily kill King Saul while Saul wasn't looking. And David didn't take them. He says, God's going to dethrone Saul when God feels like dethroning Saul. I'm not going to do it. God's blessed Saul. I don't want to be the one who attacks God's blessed one, God's anointed one. And as a consequence, David's kingdom is mightily blessed. We're going to see that next week because this week we only get to see like the start of his kingdom. But next week we're going to see it. His kingdom is an explosion of growth and wealth for their country. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is 1,000 years.
Wow.
I know. Oh, yes.
There we go. And there's all of our events on the timeline. Matter what. Starting at creation, moving into sin, and then death, and eventually Enoch rising up into heaven, and then the flood of the entire world, and then the Ice Age begins. And then the Tower of Babel, and then people spread all over the planet. By the way, the Ice Age ended. I kind of forgot to mention that. Right around here, at the beginning of tonight. Yeah, right around when Noah died. Funny story. And then we see Abraham get God's covenant blessed upon him in his whole life. And then we move on to Jacob and Esau and their big split and rejoining. And then all of Jacob's kids turn into a country, and then they turn into slaves, and then Moses frees them from slavery. And then they suffer through the period of the judges until they get a king, and that's not really all that much better. And then they get David.
David's amazing.
And that's 3,000 years in a night. Well, I mean, actually, like 45 seconds.
Why did we do this every year?
Well, yeah, but that last recap, just right there with the little white icons, that was 3,000 years. Each bar is 1,000 years. Okay, cool. Yes, Jeremiah, sir.
Why was Moses' line divided?
That's because he lives an even 40 years in Egypt, and even 40 years out in the wilderness, and even 40 years exodusing.
Okay.
Basically. The time it took for them to get to Egypt to Israel and then mess up is included in the 40-year wanderings. Not everyone mentions that, but it's the timer starts when they leave Egypt. So his life is exactly 120 years long, and he spends a perfect 40 years in all three places. Weird, right? So I just put the lines in there. I think that's cool. Anyways, that's it for tonight. One last question.
Moses do wrong?
What did Moses do wrong? God asked him to do something that would be a picture for all people for all time of Jesus Christ dying on the cross, where he smites a rock with his staff and outpours life, water, so they could have water in the desert. And he hit it more than once. And so God was asking him to perform this act that would be a perfect symbol of Jesus dying on the cross, and he screwed it up. He hit/killed Jesus more than one time. And the symbology that God was trying to show his nation was broken. And God was really upset about that. Because he said, hit it once. He told him exactly how many times to hit it, and he didn't do it. And he also yelled at the rock, which is kind of like yelling at Jesus while he dies on the cross. So, you know, there was that. Anyways, that's it for tonight. Let's pray and we'll get going. Lord, we love you. We thank you for your word.